Hello, where each tale unfolds like a cozy chat over a steaming cup of coffee. Today, I present to you a delightful new mystery starring the ever-observant and wonderfully sharp Miss Marple, the beloved amateur sleuth crafted by Agatha Christie. Settle in, and let's unravel this charming puzzle together. If you feel inclined, drop a quick comment to share where you're joining from. It's always a joy to connect with our little detective community. Now, let's dive into Miss Marple and the Strangerette. The sewing circle had not seen Miss Marple in years. Indeed, the group had quietly faded into the background, as such gatherings often do, dissolving into a haze of genteel excuses and unspoken intentions. So, when the delicate ivory card with its crisp embossed edge arrived, inviting her to a revived gathering, Miss Marple felt a mild surprise. She couldn't help but ponder what had prompted the resurrection of this particular circle. Village life had taught her that social events in St. Mary Me were never entirely straightforward. The seemingly innocent act of sewing, pleasant as it might be, was seldom the true purpose behind such gatherings. As she set the card beside her teapot, Miss Marple felt her thoughts wander back to a time when whispers and subtle ripples of scandal clung tenaciously to the sewing circle's reputation. There had been talk of an argument or perhaps a disappearance, though the specifics had faded with time. Gossip, she mused, was akin to old lace, delicate, intricate, and revealing more when held to the light. Thus, her curiosity was piqued, and Miss Marple found herself drawn in. She accepted the invitation, feeling that the past still lingered with the Mrs. Bantry sewing circle. The gathering took place in Mrs. Bantry's sunroom, where tall windows allowed soft afternoon light to spill across a table filled with embroidery hoops, biscuit tins, and teapots. The faces surrounding the table were comfortably familiar, save for one Mrs. Fanshawe. She was introduced with a hint of pride, as if her presence brought a touch of modern sophistication to the group. Newly arrived in the village, Mrs. Fanshawe had taken the little, an ivy-covered cottage stood at the edge of the verdant landscape, and there was something intriguingly deliberate in Mrs. Faw's attentive demeanor. Her polite watchfulness, coupled with a smile that never fully illuminated her eyes, hinted at deeper currents beneath the surface. Her questions, those questions were pointed yet gentle. Had anyone inhabited that cottage before? Were any of the original sewing circle ladies still around? Did the villagers still reminisce about the events of yesteryear? Miss Marple observed this curious line of inquiry from someone so newly arrived. As fingers deftly stitched and cups were replenished, the conversation meandered, weaving through the fabric of village gossip. Conversations frequently skimmed over the garden's grandchildren and the condition of the vicar's roof. Yet, as if guided by an unseen force, they inevitably returned to the past. That dreadful business began. Mrs. Bantry started, her voice fading into a conveniently vague silence. "Oh, but that was ever so long ago," Mrs. Pettigrew interjected with a brittle laugh, her hands moving her needlepoint just a bit too quickly. Miss Marple remained silent, merely watching the subtle flickers of discomfort exchanged among the older members of tragedy. "Indeed, but what kind of tragedy are we discussing, Mrs. Fanshawe?" Her needle paused, leaning in just a fraction, reminiscent of someone bending toward a keyhole, eager to uncover secrets best left untouched. Meanwhile, the others brushed off Mrs. Fanshawe as merely an eccentricity. Miss Marple, however, had spent too many years in villages to accept coincidences at face value. There was a discernible pattern to Mrs. Fanshawe's intrigue, one that traced back to specific names and incidents, all originating from that same troublesome year. It was the precision of her curiosity that left Miss Marple feeling unsettled. The manner in which her inquiries bypassed courteous topics and delved directly into past controversies and vaguely remembered identities suggested that this was not a mere newcomer engaging in trivial conversation. Mrs. Fanshawe was on a quest, but for what or whom? Miss Marple sat with her hands folded in her lap, her needlework set aside, having learned to discern the intricate design of secrets being unraveled. Mrs. Fanshawe was pulling at these threads with notable resolve. As the sewing circle came to a close, hats were adjusted and farewells were exchanged in the comfortably over-polite cadence characteristic of English society. As Miss Marple stepped into the hallway to retrieve her coat, she overheard the hushed tones of a private conversation between two older members lingering by the door. "She shouldn't have come back," one whispered. "It's too late now," replied the other, her voice laced with apprehension. "We should have told her long ago." Both women cast a furtive glance toward the sunroom, where Mrs. F. Shaw stood alone, studying a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, one taken, as fate would have it, on the steps of the very first sewing circle meeting. Miss Marple slipped away unnoticed. She slipped out quietly into the dusk, her thoughts already crafting a far more intricate design than any of the embroideries within Mrs. Banty's sunroom. Some secrets, she mused, were like stains in old linen. No matter how many times they were washed and pressed, they always managed to seep through. The afternoon was tranquil, the kind of peace that only St. Mary's could provide. Sunlight streamed softly through the open windows, casting delicate shadows on the table where the sewing circle had assembled. Conversation flowed effortlessly, reminiscent of old friends reconnecting. Light, carefree conversation flowed about gardens and the art of pruning roses, until, as if thrown into the serene atmosphere, Mrs. F. Shaw's voice emerged. "Do you know I've heard the Arkwright family lived here some years ago? I wonder what happened to them." Her tone was airy, almost too airy, suggesting the question bore no significance. Yet, Miss Marple's gaze became keen. There was a sharpness to the inquiry, an undercurrent that suggested deeper motives. It was the kind of question one might expect from someone who had done their research, someone seeking more than just idle gossip, more than mere idle chatter. As Mrs. Fanshawe redirected her focus to her needlework, Miss Merrill couldn't help but observe the nuanced way she had articulated her thoughts, as if she were already familiar with the family's past and was merely probing for reactions. Miss Merrill remained silent, as was her custom in such instances, yet her mind began to intertwine the initial strands of a mystery. The dialogue flowed on, courteous and winding, until Mrs. Fanshawe made another comment, this time laden with significance. "I wonder too about that poor girl from the 1930s, the one who vanished, do you recall? I believe she had ties to the circle, didn't she?" The impact was instantaneous. Mrs. Pettigrew, who had been knitting in silence, let her needle fall, the sound jarring against the gentle flow of conversation. Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her throat, her previously calm demeanor now betraying a flicker of unease that Miss Merrill recognized all too well. Yes, of course," Mrs. Bantry responded hastily, her tone unnaturally cheerful. "But as you mentioned, that was years ago, a dreadful affair, really. It was better not to dwell on it." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mrs. Fanshawe for a moment longer than was considered polite. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The light-hearted buzz of afternoon gossip had dissipated. Something had stirred, and Miss Marple sensed, with an instinctive awareness, that Mrs. Fanshawe's mention of the missing girl was not merely a product of idle curiosity. The remainder of the meeting unfolded with an odd awkwardness. The women returned to their stitching, their fingers moving with a briskness that contrasted with their distracted minds. Miss Marple could see it in their expressions. Their faces were taut, shoulders rigid, and an unspoken tension lingered in the slight tremor of their hands as they toiled. Gone were the easy smiles and gentle laughter. The conversation had stumbled, each woman searching for a way to steer it back to safer territory. Miss Marple's thoughts delved deeper as she observed the scene, noting the evasion of Mrs. Fanshawe's question and the way they skirted the topic. It transcended mere politeness. There was something more profound at play. She watched intently as Mrs. Pettigrew's eyes dashed anxiously toward Mrs. Bantry and noticed the almost imperceptible shake of Mrs. Bantry's head, a warning, perhaps, or a plea. The others fell silent, and the thread of conversation was severed. One of the older women coughed, as if to clear the atmosphere, but Miss Marple understood better. They were not merely avoiding the memory of the missing girl. They were concealing something. As the circle gradually disbanded, the customary murmurs of goodbye and gratitude for a lovely afternoon resonated through the hall. Yet, just as Miss Marple reached for her shawl, she hesitated. Two women, once close friends, lingered at the door, their voices barely above a whisper, oblivious to the way their conversation seeped into the hallway. "I've told you before, we can't go on like this," one said, her tone strained. "You know it's too late for that now," the other replied, her voice low and urgent. "We can't bring it up again, not now, not after all this time." Miss Marple's steps faltered, her hand poised on the door handle, momentarily halted. She hadn't intended to overhear, but in that fleeting instant, she grasped the gravity of their words, laden with the burden of the past. Secrets lingered in the air as she walked on, seemingly unfazed, yet a deep unease settled in her chest. There was an unspoken menace in their words, a quiet warning that someone among them was concealing the truth, willing to go to great lengths to keep it hidden. As Miss Marple navigated the narrow lanes of St. Mary Me on her way home, her mind pieced together the fragments of the afternoon. The missing girl, the sudden defensiveness that had filled the room, Mrs. Fanshaw's probing questions. Everything was beginning to align, but the pieces felt disconcertingly out of place. Mismatched, she felt as if she were grasping a tapestry, one where several threads had come undone, and despite her efforts, she couldn't quite weave them back into place. She halted at the lane's end, glancing back at the village green. The sun dipped low, casting elongated shadows over the tranquil streets. There was an unsettling quality to Mrs. Fanshaw's approach to the topic, something Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. Then, as if a light had sparked in the darkness, the thought emerged. This was no innocent inquiry. Mrs. Fanshawe had arrived with a specific intent to uncover a truth. But for what purpose? To expose it or to wield it for her own benefit? That evening, as she settled by the fire, Miss Marple opened her notebook, a long-held habit. She began to scribble her thoughts and observations. As the night progressed, her writing became less detailed, favoring brief, often cryptic notes to herself. Her pen scratched across the page, the words becoming clearer with each line. They all know something, but what? She penned her thoughts, pausing momentarily as if uncertain of what that elusive something might be. Closing the notebook, her mind swirled like smoke from a fire. Mrs. Fanshawe was not merely an outsider. She held the key to something far more profound. The pressing question lingered. What would she do with the knowledge once it was revealed? Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, gazing into the flames. The evening was winding down, yet the mystery was only just beginning. An unmistakable stillness enveloped the room when the sewing circle reconvened and voices fell silent. Float as cheerfully as before, conversations appeared to pause whenever Mrs. Fanshawe entered the room. She offered a polite greeting, her gaze settling on each member in turn, yet few returned more than a brief nod. Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Pettigrew kept smoothing her skirt with restless fingers, how Mrs. Banty's voice had lost its usual warmth. Even Mrs. Fanshawe, who had shown such lively curiosity at the previous gathering, seemed cautious in her questions, as though measuring each word when a gentle inquiry arose about the ideal thread for monogramming. Only half the group replied while the others exchanged uneasy looks. The dialogue shifted to safe subjects, recipes, flowers, but never stayed long, as if everyone wanted to steer clear of any suggestion of deeper issues. Miss Marple felt that something was amiss, like a piece of unfinished stitching tucked away in a drawer. These women had come together to sew, yet a palpable sense of recent tensions wove them together in a much more complex design. Partway through the gathering, Mrs. Bantry rose to pour tea. As Mrs. Fanshawe quietly circulated a plate of freshly baked lemon biscuits, their cheerful hue and sweet citrus aroma enveloped the room. Several women accepted one politely, including Miss M. Hargreaves, who delicately nibbled at the edge before dipping it into her tea. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Fanshawe's gaze flicker toward Mrs. Hargreaves. There was no overt malice, no hint of wrongdoing. Yet the moment left Miss Marple feeling oddly unsettled. She sipped her tea and continued to watch. Just a few minutes later, as Mrs. Hargreaves, she let out a sharp gasp, and the teacup rattled on its saucer. She tried to speak, but her words twisted into a strangled cough. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, and in a single terrifying moment, she collapsed. The circle erupted in alarm. Voices rose in sudden panic. Someone shouted Mrs. Hargreaves's name. Another rushed to support her, but her head slumped forward as her breathing grew labored. Mrs. Pettigrew stood trembling, while Mrs. Bantry hurried to find help. Miss Marple, feeling a familiar chill, bent closer. Whatever had just happened was minor and faint. Mrs. Hargreaves's face took on a pallor that spoke of something far more grave. By the time help arrived, she had already ceased to move, leaving behind an eerie stillness that stole across the sewing circle like a shroud. When the initial shock had subsided into hushed disbelief, murmurs began to ripple through the group. They glanced at the untouched biscuits, then at Mrs. Fanshawe, who stood off to one side with an unsettled expression. Nobody voiced an accusation outright, but the suggestion was apparent in every whispered exchange. Mrs. Fanshawe exchanged glances after all had prepared the lemon biscuits. Only she knew their recipe, only she had handled them. A few women began to edge away from her, as though proximity might bring some dreadful consequence. Mrs. Fanshawe opened her mouth to speak, but seemed at a loss for words. Her composure faltered, and she reached for her handbag as if searching for a handkerchief to steady her trembling hands. Miss Marple watched carefully, noting the fleeting moments of panic and confusion passing over Mrs. Fanshawe's face in that charged atmosphere. It was all too easy to think that the newcomer had ushered in death with her biscuits, yet Miss Marple's intuition hinted that the reality was rarely so straightforward. She watched the others as they formed quiet groups, their gazes darting from the plate of biscuits to Mrs. Fanshawe. Amid the whirlwind of conjecture, Miss Marple sensed a subtle chill creeping into her mind. One of the older members, typically shy and gentle, allowed the slightest hint of relief to flicker across her lips, as if a great weight had been lifted. Had suddenly lifted. It happened quickly, hardly noticeable unless one had spent a lifetime reading the smallest shifts in human behavior. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her own expression kindly neutral. She had no wish to startle or confront. People often revealed themselves when they believed no one was watching. In that brief instant, it seemed to her that the death of Mrs. Hare was, for at least one woman in the room, a preferable outcome. Why? She filed the question away in the quiet recesses of her mind, even as Mrs. Bantry approached, clearly shaken. "It's dreadful," Jane whispered, as Mrs. Bantry grasped Miss Marple's hand for comfort. One moment she was perfectly fine, and then Miss Marple nodded gently, offering a few reassuring words. All the while, she kept her thoughts focused on the peculiar mix of emotions swirling around this tragic event: fear, shock, grief, and a subtle trace of satisfaction. By the time the authorities arrived, rumor had already spread that poison was the likely cause, the possibility looming among them like a shadow. The somber figure of Miss Marple lingered in silence, absorbing the swirling whispers of the gathering, each theory more theatrical than the one before. Memories of past gossip flickered in her mind, particularly the notorious incident involving Mrs. Hargreaves' broken engagement and hushed accusations that had once seemed like mere village gossip. Yet, in hindsight, it bore the weight of lingering unease. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fanshawe, appearing wan and defensive, attempted to clarify her biscuit recipe to an anxious audience. The inspector asserted her innocence, yet others regarded her with skepticism, their glances laden with doubt. Miss Marple refrained from making any outright accusations or defenses. She preferred to observe the complex dance of guilt, confusion, and anxiety etched on each face. If poison had truly been employed, she contemplated, it likely stemmed from deep-seated grievances that lingered long after their inception, often igniting unexpectedly. As the gathering approached, the tension in the air became palpable. Broke up Miss Marple lingered, her mind still sifting through the aftermath. She approached Mrs. Bantry, who stood alone, folding a handkerchief over and over in nervous loops. "This isn't as straightforward as it seems," Miss Marple said quietly. "I'm afraid the past may have more to do with this than we'd like to think." Mrs. Bantry gave a tremulous nod. "We all hoped it was behind us," she whispered, "but it appears not." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her arm. "We must be cautious," she said, her voice gentle yet resolute. "One must ensure the accuracy of the facts before jumping to conclusions." With that thought, she left Mrs. Bantry to her reflections in the dimming light. Miss Marple could almost feel the stirring of old secrets beneath the surface. One life had come to an end, but the enigma surrounding it was only just beginning. Miss Marple resolved that a friendly visit to the vicar's wife would be both pleasant and revealing. She was well aware that the vicarage often acted as a discreet repository for the old parish tales, those that never quite made it into the official records, yet lingered in whispers. Upon her arrival, the vicar's wife greeted her with warmth, offering tea and a smile that suggested a depth beyond simple hospitality. They engaged in a gentle conversation about the village, discussing improvements to the church hall and the usual concerns regarding committee budgets. However, Miss Marple observed how her hostess watched her intently, perhaps sensing that her visit held more significance than mere small talk. It was at that moment that Miss Mel, with her characteristic grace, began to steer the conversation toward the past, particularly any intriguing incidents that might provide insight. In the wake of recent tragedies, the vicar's wife, after a brief pause, confessed that she had encountered certain tales surrounding the sewing circle. There was a sense of relief in her voice, as if she were unburdening herself. Miss Marple listened closely, mentally cataloging every detail, be it rumor or truth. The vicarage held secrets that the rest of the village had long chosen to overlook. Over their second cup of tea, the vicar's wife lowered her voice to share a scandal that had disturbed the village some 30 years prior, marking the beginning of it all. During one of the sewing circle meetings, a heated argument erupted, creating waves in the typically composed community. At the center of this turmoil was a young woman named Margaret Arkwright. Now, no one dared to speak openly about her, but the vicar's wife remembered the whispers that had circulated following her abrupt disappearance. Some suggested she had fled, while others insinuated a darker fate. Strangely, Margaret had left behind no note or indication of her whereabouts, leaving many questions unanswered. Whispers of the vicar's wife shared in a tone that darkened with gravity, yet nothing ever materialized from them. Speculation swirled that she might have eloped or simply vanished. All that remains certain is that she was never seen again. Miss Marple noted the tremor in the vicar's wife's hand, a testament to how a distant occurrence could still evoke a profound sense of discomfort. The name Margaret now resonated more than just a faint echo from the past. It stood as a pivotal element in the unfolding mystery, one that Miss Marple was determined to piece together. Driven by curiosity, Miss Marple ventured forth to inquire if there had ever been an Arkwright sister, someone who departed the village shortly after Margaret vanished. The vicar's wife nodded, recalling that Margaret did indeed have a younger sibling, though details were scarce. A hush had fallen over the family name following Margaret's disappearance, as if shame and sorrow had driven them into seclusion. Encouraged by Miss Marple's gentle questioning, the vicar's wife checked a small ledger of parish entries, confirming what she had suspected. The younger Arkwright girl had left the village. A village filled with relatives, soon after the scandal, revealed a surname that the vicar's wife barely recognized. Yet, when she spoke it aloud, Miss Marple felt a quiet surge of satisfaction. It matched the name Mrs. Fanshawe had used before her marriage. Thus, Mrs. Fanshawe was not merely a curious newcomer eager to unearth old stories. She was, in fact, Margaret Arkwright's sister, returned to St. Mary Me under a different name. Miss Marple thanked the vicar's wife for her assistance, her mind racing as the significance became unmistakable. Mrs. Fanshawe's questions were laden with deeper meaning. They were not idle. She had returned with a purpose, intricately linked to the unresolved mystery surrounding Margaret's fate. As Miss Marple departed from the vicarage, her mind wandered to the unexpected demise of Mrs. Hargreaves at the sewing circle. Until now, the blame had fallen on Mrs. Fanshawe for introducing the ill-fated biscuits. However, if the true target had been Mrs. Fanshawe herself, Margaret's sister, then the entire narrative shifted. It dawned on Miss Marple that Mrs. Hargreaves might have been an unsuspecting casualty of a plot aimed at someone else. Perhaps the biscuit was never meant for her at all. Mrs. Fanshawe had stirred up old anxieties with her pointed questions. If she was closing in on the truth of Margaret's disappearance, it was not unthinkable that someone felt the need to silence her. Yet circumstances had led Mrs. Hargreaves to partake of the very treat meant to eliminate a threat to old secrets. Miss Marple pursed her lips, recalling the fleeting look of relief on another woman's face. If the plan had gone awry, then the true conspirator might be growing more desperate by the time Miss Marple neared her. The afternoon light in the cottage had softened, and her thoughts began to drift back to Margaret. What had she uncovered all those years ago? What hidden truth had driven her to disappear, or perhaps to be made to disappear? Mrs. Fanshawe's resolute return now seemed entirely logical. She was not after mere gossip, but was in pursuit of whatever her sister had left behind, a secret substantial enough to draw her back to a village she had once abandoned in shame. Miss Marple paused at her front gate, contemplating the gravity of these revelations. Unanswered questions lingered in St. Mary, where someone had harbored guilt or fear for 3 decades. If they were now willing to commit murder, it hinted at secrets as potent today as when Margaret vanished. Quietly, Miss Marple resolved to dig deeper. She had come too far in her observations to let the matter rest. After all, the truth about Margaret's fate might illuminate the very poison now threatening more than one life in the village. Miss Marple set about her inquiries in the discreet manner she knew best, armed with tidbits from village gossip. An assortment of notes gathered from the vicar's records and her own memories of whispered tales allowed her to piece together the names and faces of the original sewing circle from the 1930s. It was a puzzle that demanded both patience and intuition. Some members had long since departed St. Mary, while others remained under different surnames due to marriage or remarriage. Yet, patterns began to emerge as she cross-referenced births, marriages, and gatherings held in the old church hall. That slender thread guided her from one discovery to the next. As she pieced together the fragments, each name unveiled a small corner of a larger tapestry. It struck her how frequently Margaret's name surfaced in connection with certain families, her mention in a parish announcement here, her scrawled note in the vicar's ledger there. The faint echoes of her presence hinted that she had once been at the center of it all. Given her tragic disappearance, it seemed plausible that the ensuing chain of events had intertwined many lives in guilt, sorrow, or perhaps both. In tracing Margaret's connections, she uncovered a startling thread, involving 2 women who had once shared a deep friendship, both vying for the affection of the same man, my fiancé, a charming individual whose heart seemed to oscillate between loyalty and temptation. In those times, a broken engagement was a matter of great significance, particularly in a respectable village like St. Mary. Miss Marple was careful to pose her inquiries subtly. At the post office, she asked about the old families, and at the grocery, she alluded to wedding announcements from decades past. A pattern of quiet confessions began to unfold, revealing much through mere nods. Heads lowered, voices hushed, and an undercurrent of strong emotions lingered in the air. One woman appeared to have enticed Margaret's fiancé with promises of stability and social standing, while another simmered with bitterness, resentful of Margaret's perceived influence over him. The rivalry wove through the sewing circle like a tear in delicate fabric, and amidst it all, Margaret endeavored to uphold her dignity. Miss Marple pondered whether the fiancé's shifting loyalties had sown the seeds of deeper discord. Sometimes, she reminded herself, a hurtful betrayal can be eclipsed only by an even more sinister act yet to unfold. As Miss Marple explored deeper, she encountered a string of intriguing comments that suggested something beyond mere romantic competition. Several villagers alluded to the possibility that Margaret had unearthed a scandalous truth regarding one of the sewing circle members, a truth that could devastate reputations if revealed. With subtlety, Miss Marple drew out information from an elderly neighbor who reminisced about whispered discussions concerning a debt of shame and a letter that ought to remain hidden. Never have existed, although her informant spoke in fragments. The suggestion was clear: Margaret wielded knowledge potent enough to give her leverage over someone of influence. Such a situation, Miss Marple reflected, could have turned lethal if desperation took hold. Pride, social standing, and fear of exposure formed a potent mix, one that might drive an otherwise respectable individual to commit the unthinkable. How easy it would be, Miss Marple thought, to disguise a crime of blackmail as a tragic accident or a sudden disappearance, especially if the rest of the circle chose to keep quiet, leaving her feeling uneasy. Yet a flicker of comprehension started to emerge. Margaret's ability to manipulate might have been the initial move on a journey that led directly to her disappearance and perhaps even deeper secrets long buried by time. As she assembled fragments of past whispers, Miss Marple stumbled upon a particularly incriminating detail that illuminated Margaret's tale with greater clarity. In those times, Margaret had been expecting a child. An out-of-wedlock pregnancy was sufficient to stir controversy, especially if it involved was someone already promised to another. And this revelation cast Margaret not only as a romantic rival, but also as a source of profound disgrace. Such a situation would have ignited jealousy and fear among those whose reputations hung precariously in the balance. The sewing circle, with its facade of polite needlework, might have concealed deeper tensions than anyone guessed. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to reflect on the emotional turmoil that must have erupted in those final days before. Margaret's disappearance, laden with bitter accusations, covert threats, and frantic attempts to evade public scandal, could have spiraled into violence. If multiple members were aware of the truth, they would share a compelling motive to keep it hidden, no matter the cost. The deeper Miss Marple delved, the clearer it became how a single unforgivable secret could warp friendships into enmities and cast a shadow over even the most genteel of gatherings. The legacy of those events had not diminished with time, especially with Mrs. F. Shaw's return and her incisive inquiries. Margaret ripped open the old wounds once again, and the remaining members of that original circle, now older yet still fiercely protective, found themselves reeling under the sudden spotlight of unwanted attention. Miss Marple sensed the tremor in their voices whenever the topic came up. Some responded with a cool refusal to delve into ancient history, while others appeared ready to confide, but then hesitated, as if recognizing the peril of allowing the truth to escape. What had started as a personal quest for Mrs. Fanshawe evolved into a reckoning for all involved. Everyone involved in the old scandal sensed the rising tide of fear that the complete story might come to light. If, in a moment of desperation, someone had resorted to murder again, it suggested that the darkest chapter of the circle was far from closed. As the shadows of suspicion deepened, Miss quietly pondered whether the recent poisoning at the sewing circle was, in fact, a continuation of events that began long ago. Perhaps it was not just an attempt to silence current gossip, but a means to conceal the truth about Margaret, her unborn child. If so, the true motive might reside in the hearts of those burdened by profound guilt, a guilt that had endured for decades. Miss Marple remembered the startled expressions, the trembling hands, and the faint sigh of relief she had observed on one particular face, a face that perhaps feared Margaret's story being unveiled more than anything else. With each new revelation, the puzzle became increasingly clear, yet Miss Marple felt there were still pieces unaccounted for, threads yet to be intertwined. One thing, however, was undeniably certain. The past lingered more than some wished, and the serene lanes of St. Mary-Me were now shadowed by more than mere whispers. News traveled quickly through the village. Mrs. Pettigrew had been discovered floating in her garden pond, a sight so disconcerting that even the most composed villagers felt a chill. A neighbor, noticing something pale among the lily pads, made the grim discovery early in the morning. When the authorities arrived, they found Mrs. Pettigrew gripping a tattered piece of lace in one stiff hand, sending shockwaves through the community. Within the sewing circle, already rattled by the recent tragedy, whispers fluttered through the post office, the grocers, and along the high street. Few could align the image of Mrs. Pettigrew, a gentle soul, always appearing anxious yet harmless, with the grim scene in her pond. Some speculated whether the lace held deeper meaning or if it was simply a chance find in her last moments. To Miss Marple, however, it felt far too intentional to be brushed aside as mere coincidence. She remembered the silence that enveloped the gathering, had enveloped the group whenever ancient stories were alluded to, the peculiar comments shared in hushed whispers. Now, here lay a woman who might have possessed the keys to those very stories, only to be muted in the most disquieting way. Standing at her window, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to linger on the grim truth. Another member of the circle was lost, leaving behind a trail of questions rather than resolutions, and an escalating feeling that something dreadful was brewing beneath the village's courteous facade. Hardly had the shock of Mrs. Pettigrew's demise settled when whispers began to circulate. Sprouted like weeds after the rain, whispers began to circulate among the quiet crowd. Some suggested she had taken her own life, perhaps overwhelmed by the burden of guilt from recent revelations. Accusations were directed at Mrs. F. Shaw, whose persistent inquiries seemed to unearth old secrets too painful to bear. "She looks so troubled these past days," remarked a voice at the bakery. "It's no wonder she might have done something rash." Others countered, insisting that Mrs. Pettig had exhibited signs of distress long before the circle reconvened, her empty steps echoing restlessly. Her hands struggled to complete the needlework, and if guilt lingered within her, they speculated it had become overwhelming. Miss Marple listened with patience to these theories, yet her intuition pushed back. She remembered how frequently a convenient explanation had masked deeper truths. A pond could conceal more than just a woman's sorrow. Nevertheless, the village gossip continued to portray Mrs. Pettigrew as a fragile spirit, unraveling under her own regret. It was a story readily accepted, but in Miss Marple's view, perhaps too readily, for while it might align with the perceptions of those around her, those who seek to bury the past find that it does little to illuminate the peculiar details surrounding Mrs. Pettigrew's final moments. When Miss Marple was granted a discreet glimpse of the scene, courtesy of her unpretentious connection with the local constable, she noted a distinct set of muddy footprints leading away from the pond's edge. In her estimation, these footprints were far too orderly to belong to someone in the throes of a desperate suicide. They hinted instead at a second presence, one that had no intention of lingering. She maintained a careful distance, avoiding any unnecessary intrusion. Undue interference lingered in the air, yet her gaze moved steadily along the bank, observing the pattern where the grass lay flattened beneath footsteps. It was as if someone had approached the pond under the veil of darkness, leaving only the faintest trace of evidence in their wake. If Mrs. Pettigrew had indeed taken her own life, Miss Marple murmured softly, why would another set of footprints lead away so deliberately? The constable, engrossed in his notes, appeared focused on the official line of inquiry, but Miss Marple's mind operated on a different wavelength as she pondered the implications. One might ponder the scenario where Mrs. Pettigrew encountered someone there, possibly facing confrontation or even being thrust into the water. Her last act of grasping lace could be interpreted as a silent plea for assistance or retribution. If this were the case, the notion of suicide would merely serve as a convenient disguise, enabling the true perpetrator to evade detection. Upon discovering that Mrs. Pettigrew was found clutching a fragment of aged lace, Miss Marple's mind sparked with recollection, bringing forth memories of a dress from years past, worn with pride at a sewing circle gathering not long before. Margaret's disappearance was shrouded in mystery, the lace in question uniquely crafted with a pattern that only a discerning observer might recall. The idea that Mrs. Pettigrew clutched such a fragment at her demise was too significant to overlook. Had it been torn in a struggle, or did Mrs. Pettigrew grasp it in a final attempt to reveal her assailant's identity? Miss Marple believed there was more to it than mere coincidence. Her thoughts drifted back to the old tales of Margaret, her fiancé, the whispers of blackmail, and the murmur of scandal. A piece of lace might once have held secrets far deeper than its delicate thread suggested. It has been a cherished embellishment, or perhaps a piece of a hidden puzzle. Now, it resurfaces in a deeply troubling scenario. If the lace connects Mrs. Pettigrew's final moments to a long-ago tragedy, then this subsequent death could resonate with the same enduring dread that the truth about Margaret Wright would eventually come to light. Before the constable could reach any solid conclusions, a local handyman boldly stepped forward with a shocking admission, asserting that he had been embroiled in a drunken dispute with Mrs. Pettigrew. In the midst of the pond, his anger had led him to push her, and now, as she wept and trembled, he maintained that her death was merely an accident, a result of his panic that drove him to flee. Many villagers clung to this narrative, finding a sense of desperate relief in its neatness, as it liberated them from the darker suspicions that had begun to take root. However, Miss Marple observed that the handyman's account was riddled with peculiar inconsistencies. He stumbled over crucial details. Where precisely had he encountered Mrs. Pettigrew? Why did his eyes dart nervously each time he attempted to elaborate? Miss Marple could. She couldn't help but remember the footprints at the water's edge, which could easily belong to a larger figure like the handyman. Yet, something in her intuition suggested that this explanation was too tidy, too quick. If he had genuinely clashed with Mrs. Pettigrew, would the result align so seamlessly with other, more carefully concealed motives in the days that followed? Miss Marple observed the handyman's every move, the tension in his stance, the way he shunned the gaze of certain individuals. She suspected he was operating under a sense of unease. There was an air of obligation or fear, as if shielding another, someone who perhaps held far greater sway in his life than just a client. Quietly, Miss Marple collected small observations, a hurried whisper outside the post office, a curious exchange of money seen at the back of the grocer's. With each passing day, her belief strengthened that this alleged drunken quarrel was a ruse designed to mislead the authorities. The pressing question remained: who possessed such power over the handyman that he would jeopardize himself with a falsehood? In a moment of reflection, Miss Marple contemplated the network of older women intertwined with Margaret Errar's narrative, each harboring secrets that ran profound and deep. Could one of them have devised this elaborate scheme, directing suspicion toward the most convenient scapegoat? Recognizing that the situation was far more complex than it initially seemed, Miss Marple committed herself to a deeper investigation. She often reminded herself that the truth was frequently concealed in plain sight, merely awaiting the right thread to be tugged. Miss Marple held a steadfast belief that even the most straightforward tasks could lead to unexpected revelations. The wealth of information was undeniable, prompting her to visit the local grocer under the pretense of restocking her supplies. She remained attentive, listening for the casual remarks and stray comments that often drifted through the aisles of produce and canned goods. The grocer, a man with a warm smile and an impressive memory, took pride in his knowledge of the community. He spoke softly about the village's older generation, reminiscing about the time when Margaret Arkwright first joined the sewing circle, her bright eyes capturing everyone's attention. He chuckled, reflecting on how many hearts she had turned, often without even trying. Then, as if recalling a minor scandal, he mentioned a particular quarrel, a broken engagement that had once caused quite a stir. Although the details were vague, he leaned forward and lowered his voice, suggesting that Margaret's brief betrayal had sparked more than one whispered argument in those days. Miss Marple listened politely, offering only the occasional nod or exclamation of surprise. She understood the importance of not pressing too hard. The intrigue was best savored, unfolding his tales at his own pace. As she completed her purchase, she was left with the sense that Margaret's romances were a thread woven deeply into the tapestry of the sewing circle, a thread that might yet unravel the secrets behind the recent tragedies. The next opportunity for discreet inquiry presented itself at the church fete, where Miss Marple, ever dutiful, volunteered to assist at the jam stall. Between selling jars of strawberry preserve and handing out small samples, she observed the social currents swirling about her as villagers drifted by, pausing to comment on the weather or engage in polite conversation. Yet Miss Marple's keen ears detected a sudden slip of the tongue from two women gossiping over scones. They spoke in hushed tones about how Margaret had been more than just a rival to Mrs. Hargreaves. It appeared that Margaret possessed a piece of leverage that granted her the advantage in securing Mr. Hargreaves' affections. One of the women alluded to a letter or perhaps a secret note that Margaret had threatened to disclose, startled by her own indiscretion. She swiftly redirected the conversation upon sensing Miss Marple's soft gaze. Miss Marple displayed no visible concern, simply returning a warm smile and commenting on the delightful jam. Yet, internally, her mind raced. If Margaret indeed held incriminating information about Mrs. Harrs, it could shed light on many mysteries. The lingering question was how far someone might go to conceal such knowledge. A subtle exchange with a seasoned villager later validated the grocer's earlier hints, as the villager adjusted her position. Wait uncomfortably as she spoke. She admitted that Mr. Hargreaves had once been engaged to Margaret before he ever laid eyes on his eventual wife. This was something few discussed openly, as the entire matter had been quietly brushed aside once Margaret disappeared. Miss Marple sensed that the woman felt a measure of relief in unburdening herself of such memories, though she stopped short of explaining precisely why Margaret and Mr. Hargreaves parted ways. The reasons she implied were too layered with shame and regret. When Miss Marple, with a gentle insistence for further details, the villager merely shook her head, murmuring that some matters were best left untouched. Yet, this revelation was sufficient to alter Miss Mar's perception of the Hargreaves household. Perhaps Mr. Hargreaves' union with Mrs. Hargreaves had always been shadowed by uncertainty. If that were the case, Miss Mar pondered whether such lingering doubts had contributed to the formation of past grievances or even ignited fresh ones. A heart once torn between two women might carry complexities that neither time nor careful consideration could entirely resolve. During her discreet investigation, Miss Marple came across a retired maid who had previously served the Hargreaves family. Over a cup of tea, the maid, her hands quivering slightly as she reminisced about those chaotic times, revealed that Mr. Hargreaves had maintained a relationship with Margaret even after his marriage. She asserted that these clandestine meetings persisted right up until the week Margaret disappeared. Her eyes flitted nervously, as if she feared being overheard, but once she started speaking, the words flowed freely. She remembered observing how Mr. Hargreaves would come back from these meetings visibly unsettled, occasionally carrying a hint of perfume that wasn't his wife's. Although the maid had never seen any direct confrontation, she could feel the tension of desperation beneath the surface. Margaret, she suspected, had held on to the hope of a love that could ultimately prevail, while Mr. Hargreaves struggled with feelings of guilt and loyalty. Miss Marple, ever poised, expressed her gratitude to the maid and promised her confidentiality. Yet the implications lingered heavily in the maid's thoughts, especially if this secret affair had persisted until Margaret's sudden disappearance raised troubling questions about the lengths to which Mr. Hargreaves, or someone protective of him, would go to maintain a public facade and shield the past from intruding on the present, especially now that Mrs. Hargreaves lay dead. Miss Marple observed the chilling pattern with newfound clarity. If Margaret's departure had once alleviated concerns for those fearing scandal, her re-emergence through Mrs. F. Shaw's probing questions appeared to reignite old grudges. The two murders, first Mrs. Hargreaves, then Mrs. Pettigrew, loomed ominously in the background, assumed a darker hue. It was not merely silence that was pursued, but the ultimate removal of guilt and unresolved matters. Miss Marple pondered the intricate connections that intertwined the sewing circles of both past and present, a romantic triangle complicated by hidden agreements and potential blackmail. Each revelation hinted at a potent motive, one that had never fully vanished but rather simmered beneath the surface, biding its time for the opportune moment to resurface. As she made her way home, Miss Marple reflected on the countless lives that could be in jeopardy. She felt an unsettling certainty that the perpetrator, whoever they might be, would go to great lengths to ensure that these hidden truths remained concealed. Yet, deep within her thoughts, Miss Marple held on to the belief that the last pieces of this enigma were coming together. All that was left was to weave them into a coherent whole before another misfortune struck the village. Miss Mell had long understood that the vicarage contained more than mere records of parish life. One tranquil afternoon, while helping the vicar's wife organize old documents, she, casually opening an aged drawer tucked away among neglected letters and forgotten memos, she discovered an unsent letter. Its envelope was slightly yellowed and marked with a date the very night Margaret disappeared. Miss Marple's heart gave a small, measured flutter. Here was a tangible link to a mystery that had haunted the village for decades. She handled the letter with the utmost care, as if its contents might shatter the delicate balance of secrets the village had so carefully maintained. The letter, addressed to Margaret's sister, was written in a hurried yet deliberate hand. Every word hinted at a desperate urgency and a plan that had been set into motion under the cover of darkness. Though the letter had never been sent, its existence spoke volumes. It was as if Margaret herself had tried to leave behind a final message, a plea for understanding, or perhaps a warning. Miss Marple folded the letter neatly, her mind already working with possibilities. She knew that this small piece of paper could unlock many of the secrets that had been so artfully concealed for years. With a quiet determination, she resolved to examine its content closely, certain that within its words lay the key to long-forgotten truths. Later that day, as Miss Marple sat in her study and carefully reread the letter, its true purpose began to emerge. The letter revealed that Margaret had once intended to elope with her lover, a bold and secretive plan born of passion and defiance. Yet the words on the page carried an undercurrent of dread. Margaret had feared that someone within the intimate confines of the sewing circle might discover her intentions. Circle may have sensed her true feelings. A subtle quiver ran through the words when she spoke of her lover, hinting at dreams of a fresh start away from the village's watchful gaze. The letter was not directed to a potential husband or a friend, but rather to Margaret's sister, as if she wished for her family to bear witness to her flight. Yet, the tone wavered. What began as a heartfelt proclamation of love morphed into a frantic admission of dread. It became evident that Margaret was haunted by her thoughts. that the secrets of her planned elopement might not remain hidden. This revelation stirred Miss Marple's thoughts. If Margaret had been prepared to forsake everything for love, then these subsequent events must have been set in motion by forces far more potent than mere youthful indiscretion. The plan to elope, intended to liberate Margaret, instead laid the groundwork for a tragedy that still resonated in hushed conversations decades later. As Miss Marple pondered the implications of Margaret's plan, a further deduction took shape. The letter, unsent and now in her careful possession, it hinted at a fateful encounter on that very night. It seemed likely that someone had intercepted Margaret's escape of visitor in the dark, whose intervention had derailed the elopement. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, piecing together the scant clues from the letter with what she had heard in passing over the years. The timing was suggestive. The letter's date matching the night of the planned elopement confirmed that events had taken a drastic turn. Then, who might have wished to prevent such an escape, and why would they go to such lengths? The possibilities raced through Miss Marple's thoughts, each more unsettling than the last. Was this visitor driven by a personal vendetta, a desire to protect family honor, or something far more sinister? Her intuition told her that the same individual who had stopped Margaret from eloping might now be responsible for the deadly acts that had unsettled the village. The careful, calculated intervention of this mysterious visitor was not an act of chance. It was, with intention. Miss Marple determined that the link between the past and present was no mere coincidence, but rather a thread to be tugged until the entire tapestry of deceit unraveled that very evening. As she pondered the implications of the intercepted elopement, news arrived of a fresh act of violence intruding upon her quiet contemplation. She learned that Mrs. Fanshawe had been struck from behind in her cottage. The assault was swift and unprovoked, a brutal interruption aimed at silencing any further inquiry into Margaret's long hidden secrets weighed heavily on Miss Mar's heart as she absorbed the news. It was evident to her that the attack was not a mere act of vandalism or a momentary burst of rage. It was a deliberate maneuver by someone intent on ensuring that Margaret's past and the perilous revelations it could unveil stayed buried forever. The timing of the attack, coinciding with the recent emergence of the unsent letter, was too significant to overlook. In the aftermath, Mrs. Fanshawe, despite her injuries, managed to whisper that she had received a warning of final caution, a frantic plea revealing a willingness to embrace violence in order to safeguard hidden truths. Miss Marple, embodying her signature composure, meticulously observed every nuance, recognizing that the assault was not merely physical but a blatant indication that the adversaries of truth remained active, prepared to go to any lengths to conceal the past. In the stillness that ensued after the day's chaos, Miss Marple attended to Mrs. Fanshawe's wounds with deliberate, soothing words, even as the cottage brimmed with tension. Anxious whispers about the attack, Miss Marple's focus remained on the deeper currents of guilt and fear that had long pervaded the sewing circle in private. As she wrapped a bandage around a trembling hand, she mused over the evidence that had steadily accumulated. The unsent letter, the thwarted elopement, the violent assault. It all pointed to one unmistakable conclusion. The killer, whose shadow had loomed over both past and present, must be one of the original sewing circle members, someone driven by an inescapable. A blend of trepidation and remorse fueled her determination to keep the scandal surrounding Margaret's lost future and its ramifications hidden from view. With a calm resolve, Miss Marple pledged to pursue this thread, aware that the truth, concealed beneath layers of past grievances and unspoken betrayals, would eventually surface. When it did, the legacy of the sewing circle would be forever altered. Miss Marple had orchestrated a meeting at the vicarage, cloaked in the guise of seeking help for a village charity. As the remaining members of the sewing circle gathered, a palpable tension filled the air. Their greetings were polite, yet tinged with an unspoken unease. In carefully measured tones, they exchanged pleasantries, each word laced with a hint of reluctance, as if they all understood that this meeting served a purpose beyond mere socializing. Miss Marple's composed demeanor, infused with quiet resolve, encouraged confidences, even as the dialogue meandered toward trivial topics. Each woman appeared to be concealing a secret within that charged silence. Exchanging subtle glances and brief pauses spoke volumes. The vicarage, known for its understated hospitality, now served as the arena where long-buried truths were about to be unearthed. Miss Mel's voice, gentle and precise, set the tone for the meeting, a tone that promised to reveal the tangled web of past betrayals and unspoken guilt. With the group assembled, Miss Marple began her inquiries with unassuming delicacy, engaging each woman in casual conversation, gently nudging them to recall fragments of the past. "Perhaps you might share what you recall that fateful evening," she would inquire, her tone warm yet probing. One by one, the women offered hesitant recollections, snatches of conversation, half-forgotten disputes, and moments of inexplicable tension. Their responses, laced with inconsistency and soft denials, revealed more than they intended. Miss Marple's quiet observations picked up on every pause and every faltering word. In the interplay of gentle questions and measured answers, a pattern began to emerge, a tapestry of forgotten loyalties and buried truths. Resentments, the subtle interplay of truth and omission, hinted that the truth lay concealed beneath layers of polite deflection and shared complicity. Each carefully chosen question served as a thread, drawing out the hidden details that had long been shrouded in silence. As the conversation deepened, Miss Marple began piecing together accounts of that long-ago night when Margaret had vanished. Whispers emerged, suggesting that Mrs. Hargreaves, overwhelmed by a surge of jealous fury, had confronted Margaret with a force that ended in a. One woman recalled in a trembling voice the moment of fatal push, as if Mrs. Hargreaves lost all control, her anger boiling over into something dreadful. The narrative, though fragmented, painted a picture of a collision between fierce passion and bitter rivalry. Miss Marple listened intently, discerning how each woman's account subtly shifted the focus, never directly accusing yet hinting that jealousy had transformed into something irrevocable. It was as if the very air in the room grew heavy with the weight of unspoken blame, the quiet but steady tension palpable. Revelations indicated that the moment of confrontation was not merely a spontaneous lapse, but rather the tragic culmination of long-held resentments. The fatal jealousy, it seemed, had served as the spark that ignited a series of events intertwining old grievances with the present mystery. As the testimonies unfolded, a disturbing consensus emerged. A pact of silence had been forged among the women of the sewing circle. In hushed tones, several admitted that following Margaret's untimely disappearance, an unspoken agreement was reached never to speak of it. What truly transpired that night must remain shrouded in the past. One of them whispered, a sentiment echoing the hushed dread of long-buried truths. This collective silence, steeped in both shame and an urgent need to safeguard their images, wove them together in a web of complicity. Miss Marple observed how each denial to revisit those memories only solidified the belief that the truth was too perilous to face openly. The unspoken presence, though never formally recognized, had served as the quiet sentinel of a dark secret, one that had festered over the years. Weight grew heavier with every unspoken word in the measured cadence of their replies. Miss Marple sensed that the cost of breaking that pact might be far greater than any one of them was willing to bear. Yet it was precisely that secret which now threatened to unravel the fabric of their carefully maintained lives. In a quiet, tremulous confession, it emerged that Mrs. Pettigrew had been on the brink of revealing a truth too painful for the circle to endure. Whispers suggested that her conscience, burdened by guilt and the relentless, the weight of hidden truths bore down on her, pushing her to the brink of revelation. She felt the urge to speak, to unveil the knowledge she possessed. One voice whispered gently, as if sharing a perilous secret. Yet, just as she was about to share her truth, fate stepped in. Miss Marple pondered whether the silence imposed on Mrs. Pettigrew was truly accidental or a calculated move to stifle her confession. Thus, her death transformed from a mere tragedy into a strategic act, one that safeguarded the secret while enveloping everything in a shadowy gloom. A shadow loomed over the entire circle as the truths were painfully laid bare. The sewing circle, once a tight-knit yet troubled community, lay broken in a heavy, suffocating silence. The revelation of long-hidden betrayals and unspoken complicity shattered the fragile bonds that had held them together for decades. Each member sat in quiet resignation, burdened by the weight of their shared guilt. Miss Marple observed this quiet devastation, understanding that the unraveling of secrets had rendered the circle irrevocably changed. Fractured in that somber moment, the legacy of their past misdeeds lay exposed, leaving only a shattered remnant of what once was a united front. With the formal case now closed, Miss Marple found herself compelled to pay one final discreet visit to Mrs. Fanshawe. At the threshold of the modest cottage, she was met with a reserved greeting, the kind that carried both courtesy and a trace of weariness. Their conversation was measured, each word carefully chosen. Mrs. Fanshawe's tone was polite, yet beneath it lay an unmistakable tension. Tension hung in the air, a guardedness that hinted at secrets too burdensome to release. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, inquired gently about recent events, her question imbued with subtle insistence. Mrs. Fanshawe responded with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed her lines, yet an undercurrent of something unspoken lingered. The exchange was brief and deliberate, leaving no space for overt confrontation. Yet, in the cadence of their dialogue, Miss Marple sensed that the truth had long been held by Mrs. Fanshawe, well before her return. In the village, during the ensuing conversation, Miss Marple's gentle yet relentless questioning began to peel back the layers of deception. "You came here seeking answers, did you not?" she inquired softly, her tone both kind and unyielding. Mrs. Shaw hesitated, her replies measured. It became increasingly clear that her initial portrayal as a seeker of truth was merely a facade. With quiet precision, Miss Marple deduced that Mrs. Fanshawe had known the full truth about the old scandal long before her arrival. Her words, carefully chosen, betrayed her true intent to use that knowledge for blackmail rather than for any noble purpose. The revelation was not shouted but emerged slowly, like the turning of a key in a long-locked door. In that delicate moment, the air between them grew thick with the weight of unspoken history. Mrs. Shaw's carefully maintained mask of concern began to slip, revealing a glimpse of the calculating mind beneath. Rather than exposing Mrs. Shaw's duplicity to the village, Miss Marple chose a course of quiet resolution. "It is best," she said in a measured tone, "you depart from St. Mary, allowing the past to rest in peace, for its disturbances bring more sorrow than they are worth." Her words, though soft, carried an undeniable firmness, a gentle ultimatum that brooked no further discussion. Mrs. Shaw's response was subdued, a blend of regret and reluctant acceptance. Miss Mar's judgment was not harsh, but infused with the wisdom of one who had witnessed too many lives undone by secrets. By offering this quiet solution, Miss Mar ensured that the fragile calm of the village would be preserved. If it meant permitting certain truths to stay unvoiced, it was a resolution forged from both empathy and practicality, a choice that harmonized the quest for justice with the safeguarding of tranquility. As Mrs. Fanshawe took her leave, Miss Marple paused for a moment, pondering the lasting impact of the sewing circle's secrets. In the deliberate rhythm of her own reflections, she considered how those concealed truths had molded the lives and destinies of countless individuals. The legacy of the circle was not simply one of rumor and intrigue. It was a poignant tapestry intricately woven. From love, betrayal, and quiet complicity, each whispered conversation and every half-forgotten grievance contributed to a burden that weighed heavily on the hearts of the villagers. In that silent reflection, Miss Marple acknowledged that the legacy was as intricate as the delicate patterns of embroidery once created by the circle's members. It was a legacy that, despite the passage of time, continued to haunt the present, leaving its mark on every life touched by its darkness. On her way home that evening, Miss Marple encountered a subtle yet an unmistakable sign that life in St. Mary was always in motion. A new resident had taken up residence in the now vacant cottage that had belonged to Mrs. Fanshawe. With a faint knowing smile, Miss Marple mused quietly to herself that every village begins its next tale the moment the last one concludes. The new arrival, whose presence hinted at fresh beginnings and undisclosed ambitions, served as a silent reminder that secrets once unearthed often give rise to new mysteries. In the stillness of her thoughts, Miss Marple acknowledged that while the old chapters, as the cycle of gossip, intrigue, and hidden truths neared its conclusion, each new face emerged, brimming with the promise of fresh secrets and lurking betrayals. With the quiet determination of one who has witnessed the relentless passage of time, she continued her journey, poised to witness the unfolding of the next chapter in the intricate narrative of St. Mary Main. I appreciate your company on this elaborate exploration through the shadows of St. Mary Me, where Miss Marple's unwavering wit delicately unravels the layers of long-held secrets within a charming sewing circle. Circle unveils the way a past steeped in betrayal, jealousy, and unspoken agreements continues to loom over the present. At its heart, this enigma serves as a reminder that secrets, regardless of how deeply they are concealed, inevitably find their way back to the surface, often bringing consequences that are as unpredictable as they are unavoidable. The narrative's twists reveal hidden identities and tragic actions stemming from guilt, alongside the subtle return of unresolved histories, prompting reflection on the true price of silence and the fragile balance between maintaining harmony and pursuing truth. But here's a thought to ponder. What if the new arrival in that empty cottage wasn't just a symbol of fresh beginnings, but rather the harbinger of another hidden secret waiting to be unraveled? What would you do if you discovered that the past was not as dead as it seemed? I would love to hear your theories and reflections on this mystery. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights and interpretations are what breathe life into these stories. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of hidden truths, let me know. Be sure to subscribe for more intriguing mysteries and share this video with friends and family who enjoy a good twist. Thank you for watching. And remember, in every quiet village, there's a story just waiting to be uncovered.